Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Dev Days Europe 2023. I'm Christina Koleva, your host today in Hall 3, and we're starting with amazing topic, something that we deal with on daily basis by William Bishop, who is a senior developer advocate at Miro. William is very passionate about product developer experience and the interconnectedness of the web. William, how are we going to take away the fear out of OAuth for front-end developers?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I hope to answer that by the end of this session. So yeah, thank you so much for the warm introduction, and thank you everyone for joining this session on OAuth Essentials for Frontenders. As you might have guessed from the title, I'll be introducing some of the essentials for primarily front-end focused engineers to start leveraging OAuth 2.0. But that's not to say that this won't be a good refresher for anyone who might already be a bit familiar with OAuth and its use cases. Before I jump in, I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Will Bishop, and I'm a staff developer advocate at Miro, which is an online visual collaboration platform. For those of you who might not be familiar, more specifically, I work on our developer platform, which kind of extends the capabilities of Miro via our APIs and our SDKs, so that third-party developers can build their own apps to complement Miro's native capabilities. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm really passionate about all things API related, and I've been in the API and product spaces for the better half of the last decade at organizations like Zoom, Miro, and Meetup, to name a few. So I'm really excited to take some of my learnings over the years and distill what I consider to be the essentials of OAuth 2.0 for you guys today. So with that, if you're joining me here, most likely you've either needed to, wanted to, or thought about OAuth in some capacity, but perhaps its intricacies complicated your efforts. So in any case, you won't be surprised to hear that OAuth 2.0 is actually one of the most commonly dreaded authorization methods to implement in front-end development, what with its various flows, exchanges, and other intricacies. But it's also an essential authorization flow that opens the door to a seemingly unlimited number of third-party use cases. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'll lay down some of the essentials for us to be able to start incorporating OAuth 2.0 into front-end projects of our own and start leveraging third-party services with a bit more confidence than maybe we started with. Before we dive in, I'll just quickly walk through some of the essentials. So first, we'll cover OAuth 2.0's role in front-end development and why it's valuable. I'll walk through the various OAuth 2.0 grant types, or flows. We'll master the authorization code flow specifically. And then we will put all of this in a front-end context, and we'll generate our first access token using this authorization code flow. So with that in mind, let's jump in. So what exactly is OAuth, and why does it matter when it comes to front-end development? Well, OAuth is the industry standard protocol for authorization when it comes to making REST API calls. And OAuth 2.0 is the latest generation of this authorization method. It makes sense then that if we want to bring external or third-party technologies into any of our applications on behalf of our app's users, then we need a way to be granted this permission, right? And this is exactly where OAuth 2.0 comes in. Even in front-end development, and we might be tasked with a way to incorporate some of our users' favorite tools like Google, Zoom, Miro, whatever it might be. So let's take a look at a basic example from a front-end perspective. So here we have the landing page of a virtual collaboration platform called Butter. Perhaps you're familiar with it. And we can see here in the Butter UI that it's kind of a fun, perhaps a little quirky, visual platform with a lot of emphasis on the front end, right? But aside from just this, it's also a tool that incorporates and integrates, several other platforms on behalf of its own end users, essentially bringing lots of great, separate tools into one easy UI. And taking a closer look, you can see the logos for some of our favorite tools. For example, when you go to a specific workspace in Butter, you'll notice the login with Google option. Now, I'm sure you've all seen this login with Google option, lots of other places, of course. But in this context, it's really a great, example of a platform, Butter in this instance, bringing the power of one of Google's best tools, Google Calendar, right into its own UI and experience. So when you click on the Login with Google option from the UI, you're aware that you'll enter the Google OAuth 2.0 authorization flow as an end user, granting permission to Butter to pull all the details from your Google Calendar and bring them directly into Butter's platform. This is, a great example of, how seamlessly OAuth 2.0 enables us to bring amazing third-party capabilities, right into our own applications. So given this, we're really starting to see why mastering OAuth 2.0 could be so valuable, especially when it comes to front-end development. Now, in this sense, it's more than just an authorization method. It's truly a launchpad for bringing more external capabilities into your app and to complement the native ones that you've already built. So let's, explore this a bit further. Now that we've set the scene a bit and we have a better sense of the value in leveraging OAuth, let's dig into some of the essentials, and I want to start building a kind of a technical foundation. But first things first, just a couple of reminders. So keep in mind that the bulk of the OAuth 2.0 authorization flow is handled on the back end or the server, with the exception of the user triggering the flow from the front end, which we'll cover in just a second. And keep in mind that most secure sites and services don't permit cross-origin resource sharing, or you might hear it referred to as CORS. And this means that any requests to an OAuth or really any other REST API endpoint must come from your backend. So, with these ideas in mind, let's talk through the various types of OAuth flows in a bit more nuance. So OAuth 2.0 supports a lot of different flows, or what you'll see referred to as grant types. And it's important to know that there are a number of different flows for handling OAuth authorization, but some are a lot more common than others. And generally, these flows share the same basic fundamentals of OAuth, which is that they mostly include these four components. So first, there is a resource owner. This is the entity that owns the data in the resource server. So for example, a Miro account owner would be the resource owner of their account. Next, there is a resource server. So this is essentially the OAuth term for the API that stores data that an application wants to access. So using the same example, this would be like a Miro-owned API endpoint. Then we have the client. So this is your app, the thing that's requesting access to some kind of data. And lastly, we have the authorization server. So this is the OAuth magic. In other words, this is the main apparatus that enables the OAuth flow. All right, so we've covered a lot of the main components of OAuth and mentioned that there, are a lot of different flows or grant types, but which one should we actually use? Well, ultimately, this will depend on your exact use case and the needs of your application, your end users, and, the infrastructure that's available to you. But for the purposes of covering the essentials, especially from a front-end perspective, I'm going to focus primarily on the most common flow. So you'll likely see these two flows or grant types referenced for OAuth most often. So that's the authorization code flow, and you may also see the implicit grant flow. However, the implicit grant flow is a legacy flow, but I'm showing it here since you may still see it around. But just to note, it's no longer a recommended flow. And the reason why is because this, in many ways, included an access token that was often in the redirect URL directly, without any kind of exchange in between, which is, of course, less secure. So since the authorization code flow is the most commonly used one for the kind of use cases we'll be covering here, and one of the more secure flows, we'll consider the recommended flow for incorporating into a front-end focused app. So now that I've talked a bit about OAuth's role in front-end development and covered some of the flows from a high level, I want to start mastering the most common OAuth flow. So that is the authorization code flow, and let's just jump right into it. So what does this look like? Well, in this flow, first, end users will need to authorize your application. Next, they will need to exchange an authorization code for an access token. Then after that, retrieve an access token and a refresh token pair, which will enable us to actually make an API request. And then at the end, we can actually request a new access token using the refresh token returned in the third step. So just from a very high level, these are kind of the main steps, but I want to break it down a bit further. So here we see the detailed steps of the OAuth flow broken down between our end user, our app, and our resource owner. In this particular example, I'm referring to the resource owner as Miro, but this could be Google, this could be Zoom, this could be whatever resource you're trying to use. This is a lot of information though, right? And a bit hard to tell what's going on. So let's go through this step by step. So first, our app is going to construct an authorization or installation URL. And this is how our OAuth flow will be kicked off to the end user. Next, we're going to direct our user to this URL, and they're presented with an authorization screen. So it might say something like install and authorize. When the user accepts this prompt and authorizes the app, they'll be redirected to your app's callback URL. This callback URL will contain an authorization code parameter, which your app will exchange for an access token and refresh token pair. So the access token is what will be used to authorize requests to the REST API. And then once the access token is used, you can request a new access token and refresh token pair using that original refresh token that was returned when we exchanged the auth code earlier. So, we've highlighted each of these interactions between the end user, your app, and a resource owner, but it's quite a lot. I know this helps to give us a bit of a sense of the authorization code flow, but I want to put it into context with a bit of code, right? So in order to contextualize this a bit more, let's check out a real example. And more specifically, let's start from the very beginning at the moment where the OAuth flow is initiated by an end user from the UI of a web app. So we'll start with a very basic front-end UI built in a Next.js application. So as we can see here, we've got just a white screen with a sign-in button. You can certainly use your imagination to picture something a bit more exciting. Now, once an end user clicks sign in, this will kick off the OAuth flow and they'll be redirected to an authorization page managed by the resource owner. And kind of looking at it from the back end, in this example, I'm using Miro, but we can see that our app is constructing an authorization URL based on a Miro client ID and a redirect URL, which is specified by us, the developer. And in this example, I'm using Next.js serverless functions inside this API directory, which you can see on the left-hand side. And I'll speak to this in a bit more detail in a second, but for right now, let's just focus on the code itself. So once our authorization URL is generated by our backend, let's jump back to the front end to see where this takes us. So here we see that our authorization URL brings us to an authorization or consent screen, unsurprisingly. And this is hosted by the resource owner, so Miro in this particular instance. But again, this could be Google, Zoom, whatever resource you're using. So once the end user authorizes the app, a call is then made to our application's backend, or in this specific example, one of our Next.js serverless functions. So going back to the backend here, we handle the redirect and we parse the authorization code from the redirect call that hits an endpoint in our application here. So in this particular case, that endpoint is redirect.js. Once this is successful, we then execute the code to exchange the code authorization query parameter for an access token by making an API request to the resource owner's OAuth endpoint. So in this specific example, we store the access token and refresh token in the cookies on success, but I'll get into the nuances of why you probably don't want to do that in production in just a moment. All right, so we've gone through quite a bit at this point, but don't worry if you still have some questions here. We're going to go through this flow end to end in real time in just a moment. But first, I want to take just a moment to call out some of the benefits of using a framework like Next.js, which provides us with these serverless functions and saves us a bit of time by removing the need for setting up a more typical server. So just to call out some of the main facets of using Next.js, starting with serverless functions. Again, these are a feature of the Next.js framework for functions included in the API directory, and they allow us to make API requests directly from within these .js files within our app and save us the time of setting up our own server instance. In contrast, though, if you were using a framework like React, for instance, you would want to leverage an Express server or something similar to listen for and handle this part of your OAuth implementation. The next thing I want to call out is Next.js serverless functions allow us to more seamlessly save certain information like tokens or whatever, and store them in the cookies without having to worry about passing these between our backend and our front end in a more typical fashion. And lastly, this setup allows us to avoid certain CORS errors. So things like cross-origin resource sharing, which I mentioned before, removes some of the difficulties you can encounter there. Okay, so we've walked through most of the foundational aspects of the authorization code flow and added some context around how it's triggered from the front end. Now let's take a closer look at an end-to-end example of generating an access token from our code. So I'm going to shift gears here a little and switch to a view here of my code editor open on the right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, I've got my browser. So here I have open, just a signin.js function. And what's happening here is we're actually constructing that authorization URL that I talked about earlier. And first things first, I'm going to go ahead and start my local development server. So I'll run yarn dev. Now I'm going to go to localhost in my browser. And you can see here that I've got a very basic sign-in button, right? And when I click on this sign-in button, it's going to call this signin.js endpoint in my Next.js application, and I'll be directed to this authorization URL that my app is constructing, which is the first step that we talked about. So if I hit sign in, I'm going to be brought to the resource owner's authorization page. And here we're using Miro. So Miro has one additional step where you select a team to authorize in particular. But in general, these kinds of screens for authorization and installation, you're probably quite familiar. It could be a Google one, a Zoom one, essentially just telling you what you're authorizing before you do it. So you'll hit add or authorize install. They all have similar language. And then you can see here on the right-hand side, I have an access token and refresh token that I'm logging in the console. So we know that we just authorized and successfully got the access token from the OAuth endpoint for Miro. But where did this happen and how did it happen? So to take a step back, just to go back to the authorization URL we constructed, you can see here that we passed a client ID and a redirect URL. And we're storing these here in our .env file because they're as sensitive credentials. And the redirect URL we're specifying is localhost 3000/API/redirect. So we're actually directing the authorization to this redirect.js endpoint in our application on authorization. And when we get redirected to this redirect.js file, what's happening is first, we're checking for the presence of that code query parameter, and then we're constructing a request to the Miro OAuth endpoint to exchange that code parameter for an access token. So you can see here, we're specifying the URL, which is the Miro OAuth endpoint. We're passing a few other details like our client ID and client secret, and then we're passing this query parameter here. And then on success, we expect an access token and a refresh token in the API response. So you can see here, we're calling this API endpoint, and then we're storing the access token and the refresh token. On success, for demo purposes today, I'm just kind of, console logging this so that we can see it in real time. But again, you wouldn't want to expose a token like this on production. This is really just to kind of show you the end-to-end flow. And then we're taking it one step further here as well, and we're storing these access token and refresh token in the cookies so that we could access them from the browser. But again, this is just for demo purposes. So you can see now when I go to localhost 3000, I don't see that sign in button anymore, right? And that's because we're actually using this authenticate.js file to determine if a user has an access token or not. And if they do, then we're not going to show the sign in button because we consider them authenticated. But if they do not, then we're going to show the sign in button. So to make it a little bit more clear, if we go to the application tab in our browser and we refresh the page, you can see we have these access token and refresh token pairs here in the cookies. But if we delete them, then you'll see we'll get that sign in button once again. So just to kind of wrap up this small demo, the point here is to show you kind of the end-to-end flow of what the end user sees and then what should happen generally on your back end and then what the end user sees. So there are some nuances here that I'll talk to you in just a sec about what you would want to do on a production environment. So back to the topic at hand here. which was generating an access token. There are just a couple of things that I want to call out to make sure we're clear on these before we move forward. So first, on production, you would likely want to add some additional layers of protection, such as encryption or storing your sensitive credentials in a database. A typical flow here would be to probably store something less descriptive, perhaps in the cookies, such as a session ID, and then store all the other more sensitive data in your database, indexed by that session ID for that kind of easy access. And second, as mentioned earlier, this example makes use of Next.js's serverless functions, but another, I guess, more standard implementation for this kind of app could include setting up a more typical backend and server, such as, Node and Express.js, and handling the authorization API requests, entirely on your, more formal, normal backend, so to speak. So we've covered a lot and in not too much time, but from OAuth's role in front-end development to generating an access token, I think we built a kind of solid foundation for understanding OAuth and how to implement the authorization code flow. So here is a quick look back at what we covered. So OAuth as a launching pad for bringing more capabilities to your apps. So think back to that example with Butter, where they're a really fun, kind of quirky front-end platform, but they're bringing in all these other third-party capabilities, and that really relies on OAuth as the starting point. We covered the various OAuth grant types or flows. So there were a lot of different ones, but we focused on the authorization code flow. And then, we took a front-end, back-end kind of side-by-side view of the OAuth flow with the Next.js app. And lastly, we covered the end-to-end generation of an access token. So, that is OAuth essentials for front-enders in a nutshell, I would say. I hope, you were able to learn a thing or two if you weren't familiar with OAuth, and perhaps if you already were, this was a good refresher. But now it's really up to you to start extending the capabilities of your apps with the power of OAuth to leverage, third-party APIs. If you're interested in, learning a bit more about some of the topics that I dived into today, I definitely recommend checking out the, Next.js serverless functions. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can also find, an on-demand version of this kind of talk for OAuth Essentials here on the link on the screen. But that is everything I have for you all today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, William. That was insightful, straightforward, practical. We all need to see, really to see that OAuth is not so scary, and we have to use it anyway, and we all use it, so it should not be a taboo for anyone.
Exactly.
On the contrary. I have a question.
Yeah.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think one of the biggest things that I think is important to keep in mind with OAuth, first of all, you're kind of reliant on the resource owner in terms of the endpoint, authorization, and being able to access their APIs. So, really making sure that you're familiar with each resource owner's specific, infrastructure and documentation and things like that. OAuth 2.0 is generally, a very standard kind of authorization method, but every resource owner has their nuances. For Miro, we have the additional step where you authorize a specific subsection of your resource or your account. But other things like Zoom or Google, they also have their kind of niche aspects of the OAuth flow. So taking those into account is important.
We all authorize apps here and there as users.
Mm-hmm.
What we as users should be paying attention to?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think oftentimes we'll just kind of click next, authorize, whatever without really thinking about it. But especially as so many apps and platforms start integrating, endless numbers of other third-party tools, they all have access to different parts of your account and different parts of your data. I think it's really important to actually pause and take a look at what you're authorizing. When you get to that authorization screen, typically it says, this app is going to access your X, Y, and Z. Make sure you're actually okay with that. And, it may not also end with the direct resource that you're authorizing. They could share it further. You need to be aware of, clicking authorize and install may not just end with the one application you're authorizing.
Thank you for these answers and thank you for the very great session. It was really affirming that just tame the beast and,
Yeah.
and
Awesome.
it brings great opportunities, great user experience, but also minds how you're managing it. Thank you, William, and thank you,
Yeah.
everyone. See you in a bit.
Thank you so much.
This is all we got. Remember the revolution in our minds. This is all we got.
Lock me out of this life institution. I am angry and I on illusions. Yes, I hate, but it's not a solution. Try my best, but I'm just a human. Oh, we don't need to say we're sorry. We don't need to worship ever start. We don't need to say we're